I suggested in a previous reflection that Psalms 92 through 100 celebrate the Lord's kingly rule. So let's look at Psalm 97 briefly. This idea comes out in the very first two lines, where the writer calls us to reflect on the Lord's reign, and he invites the entire world to rejoice. This also comes out towards the end of the psalm, where the writer reflects on how the Lord is the greatest of all gods. That is, he is the one true God, and all the other gods, little g, are false. And so a contrast is drawn, as you can see here in the middle of the psalm, where ironically, the writer calls the false gods to worship the true God. It's interesting because in the character of the remaining Psalms, the writer reflects about how the false gods do not have eyes to see, ears to hear, noses to smell, lips to speak. And I might even add, by implication, they do not even have brains, so to speak. They are not capable of thinking or responding as humans could respond. And so this makes me wonder if, in at least one sense, the writer is referring actually to people when he calls the little gods or the false gods with little g to respond to him. And today I'm thinking that many people actually, instead of worshiping gods in terms of physical items or idols made out of wood, stone, brick, clay, or whatever other statues, so to speak, that people might fashion. That today, at least in this country, in the US, many of the false gods that people worship are actually other people. So interestingly, as the writer reflects upon these great truths, I can see at least four responses. And I can almost hear the voice of the Messiah calling us to respond in these fashions. He asks us or challenges us to be glad, as you can see in the first couple of verses. And as he calls the false gods to worship him, that by principle, we, all of us, the entire world, should also worship him. He calls upon all people to hate evil. And then you can see at the end of the psalm, he returns back to that theme of praising God joyfully. And so as I reflect upon this psalm, there are a lot of different aspects of strategy and communication going on here. And I've pointed this out in several other psalms. How in many of them, there are mixtures of instruction, calls to praise, confession, challenges, declaration, reflection. And so it's often difficult sometimes to try to separate these aspects because they blend into each other. So I just point out a few of the ideas here that might challenge all of us as believers in Jesus Christ to respond to the Christ speaking to us through these psalms, and particularly for the moment, Psalm 97. Philippians 4:4-5 comes to mind as the Apostle Paul two times calls the people, his readers, his listeners, as the letter would be read, to rejoice. Similarly to this psalm, for as this psalm calls the people two times to rejoice, so does the Apostle Paul. Not that the Apostle Paul necessarily has this psalm in mind, but the idea comes through and reminds us of how Messiah Jesus himself is speaking through these psalms on the basis of what the psalm writers were reflecting and how they look forward to this coming Messiah. As Paul points out here in Philippians, we have reasons, that is, we believers in Jesus Christ, to rejoice constantly because the Lord is near, even as this psalm anticipates. In a sense, the nearness of the Lord's coming, even though the nearness was not completely understood as is fulfilled, we receive in New Testament scripture.